So hello, everyone. And I just want to say I couldn't agree more with that description of the family cycle. I think what I'm really interested in is kind of spreading an approach to kids and families and parents who've experienced complex trauma, as opposed to a really kind of narrow and prescriptive intervention. So my hope is that this is a really kind of flexible framework or activity that you will find applies to a lot of different clinical situations. Just real quick, a little bit about my background. I worked for over a decade in an intensive in-home program. So that's really where a lot of these ideas come from, my practice there. Most of the families that I worked with were highly stressed, with lots of different type of stressors and lots of trauma. So also living in poverty, I would say that those are the big kind of, so this work really comes from my clinical work. There are a couple of points that I would like maybe some audience participation. We'll see if you guys are in the mood for that. And if not, I can move on to plan B. So what we're going to start with is really trying to mentalize, because I've found that the best way to really learn what mentalizing is to practice, or is to try it out. So if you all are up for it, take a minute and think of a relationship that you have, someone that's close to you. And I'm going to put a little twist on it. I would like it to be someone maybe where there's some ambivalence or some discomfort in the relationship. So take a minute and think about that relationship and jot down a couple feelings you have about the relationship. Maybe think about what are your needs from that relationship and why do you keep that relationship? I'll give you a couple minutes. Maybe as folks are done, you can put like a little emoji hand on your screen. So now I want you to do the same thing, but think about it from the other person's perspective. So imagine how they would answer those questions I just asked you to answer about you. So what would they say a few of their feelings are about you? What are some of the needs that they have from their relationship with you? And what are some reasons that they keep this relationship with you? I'll give you like 1 more minute. Okay. So any kind of initial comments about what that was like? What did it feel like? Was it easy? Was it difficult? Most of the time, this is difficult. Most of the time, it requires you to be in a quiet and calm, regulated space where you can very much intentionally shift into using a different part of your brain. And so the purpose of doing this activity was really to have you practice making that shift and think about where you need to be mentally in order to make that shift. And also to think, maybe not just to think about, but to experience what you are often going to be asking people to do with this approach, which is, and especially when it's about, when you're trying to imagine the perspective of someone who you have ambivalence about, it's even more difficult. Okay, so now I'm going to do a little background on mentalization. That is what the actual experience of mentalizing someone is. Imagining someone else's perspective, imagining their thoughts and their feelings and their needs, their beliefs. So children who can mentalize are more likely to develop a stable sense of self and identity over time, often have a better understanding of their feelings and their motivations, and can be curious about others. Children who can mentalize can regulate strong feelings and are able to engage in communication, flexibility, and compromise. And these are all kind of part of a developmental process over time. Parents who can mentalize are curious, playful, open, and sensitive. All of these things which factor into making a child feel loved and valued and safe and understood. These parents also can understand that a child can hide or disguise their feelings. Maybe a child says they don't care about something, but that's what's on the surface. Maybe a child says that they hate them, but really what are they actually communicating with that? These parents also are able to consider a child's developmental age and how much that's impacting their beliefs, their motivations, their thoughts, and their feelings. These parents also know that how they are acting and feeling impacts their child. And ultimately, these parents can kind of believe that their child is essentially good or trying their best or ultimately well-intentioned. Okay. Mentalizing in behavior, what it really looks like is flexibility, playfulness, active listening, awareness of and responsive to what another's body language is communicating. And you can really feel it in a room when you are with someone who's good at mentalizing. So the whole reason I kind of did that preface for you is because this activity is all about mentalizing. This activity is about you all as therapists mentalizing. It's about helping a parent mentalize a child. It's about helping a child mentalize themselves. It can also be about helping a parent mentalize themselves. And I will talk to you about all of those different ways. So one way to think about what a secure attachment is the experience of being mentalized over time. And in theory, we call this a secure internal representation. Your relationships have conveyed the message that you are worthwhile, that you are loved, that you are valued, and that you are safe. And this needs to be kind of a repeated experience in your relationship with your primary people, whomever they are. And it doesn't need to be bio parents. It can be grandparents. It can be adoptive. It just needs to be a sensitive adult who can mentalize, or who's working on mentalizing you. And often you can switch out mentalize for working to like try and understand and to show you that they care. So this is a secure attachment. And then we also have a lot of other variations. So a secure attachment really is to feel safe and loved and supported, and to be heard and seen and known. And we know that this is associated with a range of, having an insecure attachment is associated with a range of parental traits, including not having had a secure attachment themselves, having had lower levels of trauma exposure, and it's also associated with a range of positive child outcomes, including fewer behavioral problems and fewer mental health problems. So a secure attachment is really important, and it's very interconnected with the experience of being mentalized over time. So how does childhood trauma, adversity, and stress impact mentalizing? So when there's not mentalizing in a parent-child relationship, there's less opportunity to practice emotional co-regulation. So a parent helping a child calm down with an attachment figure. There's also not a consistently safe and nurturing environment in which to explore your thoughts and feelings safely with, which is really important. And we also see like a parent cannot provide kind of predictability and comfort in a consistent way for a range of reasons, including but not limited to parent mental health problems, parent pain, medical problems, employment problems, all sorts of other stressors that can factor into what's impacting a parent and their ability to be sensitive to their child. So enter in complex trauma. And this is really an idea that when a child is feeling an ongoing sense of fear or hatred or horror or helplessness or disgust or powerlessness in all its different manifestations over an extended period of time, with the perception that they are trapped and unable to escape, that this is really damaging to our relationships, to our ability to regulate our feelings, and ultimately for kids, to their development and to the development of their brain. There is a slew of research that points to the kind of cumulative exposure of adverse childhood experiences is connected to a lot of negative long-term health impacts, which we can talk a little bit more about later. And also a lot of research that documents kind of differences in outcomes depending on when it happened and how often it happened and how severe was it. And so this kind of experiences of multi-victimization or poly-victimization, this is kind of very specific area of interest to me, and a specific area of interest to the family cycle too, because it's really, the ideas are informed by this idea that oftentimes kind of trauma and stress and things that need to be worked through and talked about aren't acute and single incidences, right? There are many incidences over the history of a relationship that can be addressed. So here is just kind of a visual to help you think through what these concepts, what some of these words I'm using mean. So complex trauma, developmental trauma, and attachment trauma are all kind of similar and interrelated and overlapping concepts, along with toxic stress and adversity. And underneath we have a lot of different types, though I will say that these tend to be quite kind of US centric. And so there are a lot of kind of, when we think on an international scale, there are a lot of other experiences you could put underneath that umbrella, like experiences in war or migration experiences, or, you know, maybe attachment experiences due to your parents going off to war or your parent. So kind of thinking about this as a really a broad concept, as any experiences that a child has that are scary or very strong negative emotions in which they feel alone in. So I would say this activity is very much so kind of complex trauma informed. And although this is not a DSM diagnosis, it's really challenging folks to kind of think beyond these diagnoses that are very narrow and descriptive only of kind of behaviors, moods, and really, instead of describing symptoms, thinking about what's happened in a person's life and how this has impacted them. So instead of a lot of different diagnoses, really thinking in terms of this all being part of something similar, what it means to experience just trauma and stress and poverty over and over again. Yeah. So just kind of a window into mentalizing a traumatized child, right? So for a traumatized child, the world is punitive and judgmental and humiliating and blaming. Control is external and not internal. People are unpredictable and untrustworthy. There's a feeling that they have to defend themselves. And admitting mistakes is worse than the vulnerability associated with telling the truth. So just a little more groundwork before I go into the activity. The other piece that has really influenced this activity is this idea of epistemic trust or epistemic mistrust. And what this idea really means is it's the ability to trust others as a source of knowledge about the world. But not only that, it goes beyond that into just the ability to feel safe in a relationship. The ability to feel like someone is not trying to hurt you, someone is not trying to get one over on you. Just kind of it's really this idea that there's a genuine goodness and that there's a desire to spread information and to help people learn. And it's really important to have this in order for someone to be receptive to learning and therapy. And we know that this inability is very, very connected to folks who have experienced difficult things in their lives. Complex trauma, adversity. And having had those experiences is often connected to a misattribution of intention and the assumption of negative intention. So I will give you, I'm gonna illustrate that for you now. So imagine that you are an 8-year-old and your mom's boyfriend is frequently kind of coming home drunk and getting really angry and scary and breaking things, and you hear them argue a lot, and you know, you start to see your mom not do anything, not change the situation, and you start to see him hurt her more and more. And so as a child, if you want to, you could maybe try and think about what's happening in those adults' heads that aren't taking care of you and aren't protecting you. But that's going to be really painful and difficult and complicated emotionally. So instead, you're going to turn that off. You're really not going to want to think about what's happening in the minds of people who are not keeping you safe, of people who are hurting you, or people who are ignoring you, or sometimes it's of just people who aren't there, aren't involved in your life. Regardless, those tend to be really the painful realities that a child would have to think through. And so the choice is to stop thinking about it. And we know from earlier when I talked about how important developing this mentalization capacity is, that it's not great when a kid stops. And it's even worse when the stress in a parent's life is making them unable to mentalize. So the theory of change with the family cycle. First, we use it really to name, narrate, and make sense of early and often traumatic relational experiences, with the idea that that is going to be a regulating experience, especially when you're doing that with someone who understands you, has been thinking about you, also known as your therapist. Mentalizing the other. This is also really important. So the family cycle is not just something for kids. It's designed for all different types of relationships. And so what I've written about so far is kind of parent-child relationships, family relationships, but I also really feel that it's useful for couples and for extended family relationships, because really what it's about is helping understand someone else's perspective. So when you do a family cycle with a parent, you're really then helping them to name, narrate, and understand the child more clearly. And the idea is that this really feels good. This feels validating, and it feels good to be known and to be seen. And so it's really a different approach, maybe from a classic behavioral approach, where you would go in and talk about consequences and incentives. Instead, you're really pivoting to focus on building the relationship. Because from my perspective, consequences and rewards and expectations and all of that is meaningless and not very effective when you don't have a relationship, when you don't have a connection. When you use the family cycle, the goal for the parent is really shifting the point of attention. So a lot of times parents will come to you and say, my kid is acting out, they're not doing their homework, they're lazy, they won't get out of bed, they're refusing to go to school, what have you. So meeting that with curiosity, shifting the point of attention, stepping back to watch, listen, and become curious about, instead of, these are all the bad things they're doing, what's going on for them? How are they feeling? What's happening in their heads? What are they thinking about? perspective taking. So instead of assuming that they are the same, that they have the same perspective, really thinking developmentally about where they're at and what their worldview is based on how old they are. Trying to imagine, for the parent to step back and try and remember and imagine what it might feel like to be 14. And then ultimately providing empathy. So validating someone's experiences. Shifting it from something that no one could talk about and no one ever did talk about into something that has been talked about in a safe context and processed. Okay, so that's your task. So a mentalizing stance is, instead of trying to control behavior, you're trying to make sense of it. Instead of trying to stop behavior, you're trying to understand it. You're really thinking about behavior as communication. And instead of assuming you know what's going on, you shift to wondering what's going on. And so there are a lot of ways that this approach is counter to a behavioral approach, counter to the medical model on many levels. So we're not just diagnosing and addressing symptoms, we're really trying to understand how we got here and help someone understand themselves better. Overarching goals, I would say these all kind of fall into a mentalization-based practice, and many of you may eventually, I don't know how many people are actually practicing. I think there are a lot of students listening. Eventually, you will be developing your approach. And key to a mentalization-based approach is this idea of self-awareness, right? We need to be self-aware if we're going to be practicing and trying to build self-awareness with other people, with families. Flexible thinking, so being able to regulate your emotions and pay attention to how you're feeling in your body and what you're thinking. Thinking while feeling, so this idea of empathy, support, attunement, letting someone know that you are with them. Curiosity, right? There's a lot of different ways. Not just questions, it's also clarification and trying to elaborate and maybe challenging if something's confusing, not in a threatening way. All different ways of showing that you are interested and curious and listening. You're there. Dialectic, so highlighting alternative perspectives, really trying to help someone put themselves in someone else's shoes. And interpretive, this idea of helping children put their thoughts and feelings into words. Especially when you're working with kids, it's super, super important that you remember you can't just expect them to know how to talk about their feelings. A lot of the time, they're not going to have any of that foundation because no one's ever talked to them about their feelings. So there's not that kind of foundational ability to name, label, and narrate their own feelings. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about the activity. If any of you are planning to do clinical practice, I would advise you to try and take some notes because this is an actual activity that you can use. Okay. So one way to think about the family cycle for you is as a kind of clinical formulation. A way to think about a child that is taking it away from kind of a child-only problem, taking a psychiatric issue, diagnosis, away from being a child-only problem into kind of something that's influenced by relationships and by the past and by what's going on at home. So all of these external factors. So we really start, I think the best place to start is with the unacknowledged loss. And so the reason I talked so much about complex trauma is a lot of these experiences will fit into this circle. So experiences of growing up with a parent with mental health problems, or growing up with a parent who has serious medical problems, having kind of a disrupted attachment from one of your parents. Maybe you have no relationship with one of your parents. Having your parents had a really difficult separation or divorce. There's also kind of the more classic kind of maltreatment. So there's like neglect, not being able to meet basic needs. And often this is connected to a parent's mental health problems or a parent's kind of substance use issues. Interpersonal violence is another huge one. Family violence, domestic violence, exposure to it. What is it like to grow up in a home where the grown-ups are hurting each other? So those tend to be kind of the most obvious things that fit into unacknowledged loss. I'll say also what I hear over and over again from kids are really acute and profound and long-standing experiences of alienation in their family systems. So sometimes this is due to maybe having a different biological father than the rest of your siblings. Sometimes there are kind of racial or kind of components to it where a child feels like they look very physically different than their siblings. Sometimes it's because the child is on the GLBTQ spectrum, right? Or is feeling like they are non-binary or they are trans, and feeling rejected by their family. And those are just a couple, examples. Sometimes it's because the child is not neuronormative. So maybe they are a little bit on the spectrum, or maybe they have a learning disability that makes it difficult they feel less connected or they feel less understood. So unacknowledged loss is really specific to the child. It's kind of feelings that they've been alone in, that they've not been able to acknowledge with a safe adult. And so people always ask me, okay, but like, what do you write? And so that's really, it's more when you are doing this in a session, there's going to be a lot of buildup. And I'm going to talk to you about that and some different activities you can use in a little bit. But it's not about making a list or an inventory. It's really helping a child choose a phrase or a couple words. Sometimes it's just descriptive words that capture their experience of their childhood. So really common ones have been like no safe space, or I lost my voice. So no safe space was a child who described really intense domestic violence throughout most of his parents' relationship that ultimately ended in kind of protective services involvement and dad almost trying to strangle mom. So this child chose everything was violence. Another child chose shattered fragments to describe his experience of being, watching his mom, kind of finding his mom after she had attempted suicide, being removed by the cops and placed in foster care, right? And so how do you even, when you talk about situations like that, it's like, what part of that is traumatic? Pretty much every part of that was traumatic. So how do you kind of pinpoint? And so for this kid, what he chose to describe with the kind of shattered fragments, like how the memories come back to him. Every child is going to be different and they'll need your help. But it should resonate on some level. I've had kids also just use violence, just one word. Sometimes kids will say ups and downs. Sometimes kids will say, sometimes kids will be more specific and sometimes they'll be more general. But really it's about kind of working collaboratively to find and name experiences, because the important part is less what the phrase is and more the conversations you're having with the child. The next step is the unexpressed belief. So these are kind of how you internalize your childhood experiences and what your experiences in your early relationships tells you about the world and about yourself. And so these can be things like nothing is safe, I can't trust anyone, it's all my fault, I'm disgusting, I'm unlovable, I'm invisible, I'm not safe, I'm a failure. All different variations of kind of negative ways that you can internalize really difficult experiences, particularly when they're unacknowledged, particularly when someone has not helped you think through what's happened and make sense of it. So the next step is really thinking about how these internalized negative beliefs are confirmed, often more subtly on a day-to-day basis, just by the home environment. So for a child who feels that nothing is safe, and at home, if maybe mom is kind of frequently having friends over who they don't know, who they feel uncomfortable with, and they are drinking and smoking, that would really exacerbate a child's anxiety who's feeling like no one is safe. For a child who, say, was kind of sexually abused for many years and finds their body really disgusting, maybe at home if mom is really focused on being fit and always kind of focused on food and exercise, and that would really, unclear how that would feel for that child, right? So maybe that would make that child feel more disgusting. For a child who chooses something like maybe my family rejects me, right? So maybe they are a trans kid, or maybe they're non-binary. My family rejects me. My belief is that maybe there's something wrong with me. And at home, maybe it's that like no one's using the chosen name or pronouns, right? So just doing a lot of thinking about how past experiences create internal representations. And then when you have a home environment that is not a mentalizing home environment, there are a lot of ways that that could be kind of subtly invalidating. And when that happens, when you kind of have this constellation, you get buildup behavior, which can look like a variety of externalizing or internalizing behaviors. And when I'm doing this with a parent or child, I'm always saying like, hey, cut that circle in half and describe both the behavior and the feeling state, because it's really important to be kind of have that on repeat. There are not behaviors without feelings. So instead of why did you do that, it should be what's happening in your body, what's going on, what are you feeling, right? So I'll go through my examples again. You have the kid who chose everything was violence, experienced a lot of domestic violence, believes that no one is safe. At home, mom is partying a lot, and that makes him really anxious. So we have anxiety as his feeling state, and that presents itself as oppositionality and disrespect, right? And so the external reaction, mom's reaction, is only to the behavior. It's not putting the behavior in the context of the feeling state, of the home environment, or of the past. So when you get that disrespectful behavior, maybe mom says, you know what, you can't live with me anymore. And so this is mom going into a kind of a non-mentalizing mode. And that non-mentalizing mode is really going to reconfirm this idea that nothing is safe and I'm not safe. And then that acute feeling of invalidation will send a child into crisis. And for the kid that I'm talking about, this was a kind of an aggressive, out of control crisis. So I'll go through another. So you have the child who has a long history of maybe sexual abuse by an uncle. Maybe that's been in their childhood and they're coming to you in their teenage years because they're having a lot of problems as they reach puberty, which is typical. So you have, I lost my voice to describe years and years of sexual abuse. The belief that like I'm disgusting at home, kind of my mom is perfect, really healthy, always exercising. And so I overeat and feel a lot of shame. I overeat, I stay on my computer, I isolate, I don't leave my room. Maybe since COVID, I've not gone to school either. And so the parents' reaction is, well, I need to send my child away, right? Or we just really need to focus on, you know, getting her to exercise and getting her to eat healthy. Maybe that's what the parents' focus is on. And that is just reconfirming this belief over and over again, like I'm disgusting, I'm disgusting. So the child then becomes suicidal. All right, I'm gonna do one more. So we have our trans kid who chooses, I feel like rejected. No one in my family loves me because there's something wrong with me. At home, no one is kind of using my right pronouns or my right name, my chosen name. So I start to cut myself. I self-injure. And it's because I feel this intense insecurity and ambivalence about who I am and whether my family could love me. And my parents don't know about it. I can't tell them. I can't tell them anything. They don't know about it. And when they find out, they're very uncomfortable and kind of don't just tell me to stop doing that. So it gets to the point where the child becomes suicidal. So I'm hoping this makes sense. This is really, so the idea is that first you do it for yourself. This is you trying to mentalize a child. You try and really kind of think through how would they respond. And so here is a slide that where we have kind of some of the prompting questions that you might use. So when you're talking to a child, like, what's your biggest hurt that's been hard to talk about? What are painful things from when you were little? Kind of describe your childhood in a couple of phrases. What is something that you feel like is missing from your relationship with your parents? These are just some choices, some options, some ways to talk about it. And then kind of talking through that, you know, how did that make you feel? What did that make you believe about yourself after you experienced that? And what's happening at home now that confirms that belief, makes that feeling worse? And how does that come out? What do you do when that feeling builds up? How do other people respond to you when they're not understanding? Okay. So I'm going to go through a case presentation and show you some of the other kind of clinical activities and drawings that you can use to really enrich this activity when you're working with a child. So We have Elijah Warren, 12-year-old African-American male, referred by a kind of residential treatment program, who is kind of gets angry and aggressive, and that's what all the referrals say about him, is on a bunch of different medications, has a bunch of different diagnoses. People are seeing him as kind of a mood disorder, like depression, impulsivity, aggression. Okay. None of which give us very much information about what his life has been. So that's what I'm going to tell you about next. So the program that I direct, and my belief pretty much for all kind of folks who are practicing therapists, you should always do a genogram. Always, always learn about the family and the history of someone you're working with, regardless of whether they're a kid or an adult. So as you can see from looking at Elijah's genogram, we have Elijah at the bottom. He has two older brothers that he has an estranged relationship with. He has a different biological father from them. His biological father has been incarcerated since his infancy and had a pretty serious drug problem. We have mom, who is Monique, who has a diagnosis of bipolar, a history of suicidal ideation, and a long history of homelessness. She was homeless when he was born. And in his infancy had to deal with kind of her only source of support, her partner, his father, relapsing and then getting incarcerated. Then we would look at Monique's family tree. We see that she also had a really, really difficult childhood. Her father was a long-term alcoholic who was very violent and also involved with the kind of police. So almost in some ways that made his protected his violence, made it so that there was no recourse, or I think it felt like there was no recourse for her. We have her biological mom dying of a heroin overdose in her infancy, and her psychological mom dying from bone cancer in her early adulthood. So really limited supports there. And as you can see also Monique's siblings, there's a lot of strain and disconnection there as well. So always thinking systemically, always starting with the family and thinking about the loss and the intergenerational piece. The next thing when conceptualizing the unacknowledged loss that I really recommend is a timeline. Really helps you give a sense of a child's life. What's happened? So we can see that the genogram gave us kind of one perspective, but the timeline introduces us to even more kind of new information. So we have kind of a visual showing how precarious their housing situation was. We also have a kind of marker and an understanding of when mom's mental health was at its worst, to the point where she's psychiatrically hospitalized, and can start to think about what did this separation at 6 years old feel like for this child? And what did they know about it? What were they thinking? Where did they think she went? Then we see really the kind of early part of his life setting the stage for a lot of problems in school contexts later in life. And ultimately this kind of residential stay and protective services involvement. So in many ways, you think instead of this child being kind of diagnosed with ADHD and DMDD, it's like his life is those things. His life is ADHD. It's all over the place. There's no consistency. There's not even a home base. Also think about his very early childhood. So we know that this was an incredibly stressful time for mom. She was homeless. She had very little support. And in those cases, we know that kind of mentalizing this really important piece of kind of meeting the needs of your child, and understanding in infancy that all the annoying things that babies do are just them communicating, or just them asking for help. But holding that frame is so hard when you're under a lot of stress, on top of having just lost your partner for an incredibly long period of time due to incarceration, and probably just feeling so alone. So the hypothesis is then that maybe kind of her responses were more unreliable, more unresponsive, more scary sometimes. And this really kind of making it so that Elijah doesn't have an organized way of getting his needs met. Going back to this idea of co-regulation, so important for a parent to help soothe a child, for a parent to help kind of consistently meet a child's need, or an infant's needs, over and over again. And all the different barriers that might have been going on for Monique that would have prevented her from being able to do so. Really kind of thinking about that early attachment experience as well. I have some pictures, just to kind of humanize the case for you all a little bit. So this is called Boat Lighthouse Storm. It's was developed by Lena Lowenstein. You can find it online. I really like the prompt. You have families draw it and then ask them to write a story of what's happening in the picture on the back. And so here we have Monique's, which is just very tumultuous. The boat and the lighthouse are both being struck by lightning. And there's really some kind of clear indication that, you know, she's not feeling very safe. There's a lot of dysregulation. There's a lot of feeling of out of controlness portrayed through this picture. And here we have Elijah's, which is almost disappearing, right? So I actually had to go and pick this out of the trash because he tried to crumple it up and throw it away. You could see he started to try and erase it too, but there was something that was really kind of painful about this experience. I don't think he sat and drew with his mom very often either. So his is really more about kind of disappearing and feeling alone and kind of feeling like all the negative is just coming onto him. Okay. So next circle, we kind of have, so that's unacknowledged loss, right? Thinking through all of these different things. And I will say that part of thinking through this with Elijah was really looking at his timeline and talking about what his life had been like. And you'll see at the end when I show you his completed family cycle, but he chose for his unacknowledged loss, lots of ups and downs. And this kind of unacknowledged part being really key here, because mom has been so kind of in her own picture of chaos that she's not been able to acknowledge what's happened with him. They've never talked about anything. Okay. So unexpressed belief, another kind of like this idea is very much influenced by kind of attachment theory and the idea of internal representations, but also these ideas kind of about developmental trauma and complex trauma. And so part of the kind of, it's been over a decade now, proposed criteria for developmental disorder was this idea of persistently altered attributions and expectancies. And to me, this is very akin to the idea of the unexpressed belief. So you have like negative self-attribution, you have distrust of your caregivers, a feeling that no one's going to protect you, that you can't trust social agencies because they might hurt you or take you away or put you in a situation that makes you feel even more out of control. It's one of my favorite activities to do with kids. And so this is Elijah's. The prompt is really to do an X for kind of the statements that you agree with, and, or sorry, a check for the ones you agree with, and an X for what you don't, what you disagree with. And as you can see from Elijah's responses, he's saying, I disagree that the adults in my life don't keep me safe. When someone leaves me, loves me, they won't leave me. I'm not sure. I don't know. My behavior makes me hard to love. Definitely. I hear that over and over and over and over again. I always know what I feel. No, I have no idea what I feel. I don't even know why I act the way I do, right? I'm a good person. Not sure. I feel out of control most of the time. Yep, that's me. So all of these responses are really kind of painful to hear, but it's a great way of not doing it directly and head on, and doing this kind of interpretive piece where you're asking a child for their perspective and not expecting them to generate it with open-ended questions. And it's a really good way to get into some of their experiences too, like, this is what you believe. You can also go backwards. Why? What happened? What brought that about? And so when doing this with Elijah, the kind of, when someone loves me, they won't leave me. So we got into dad's absence. We got into brother's absence from his life. We got into a lot about his relationship with mom. Another activity that just kind of shows what's on the inside. And when we, got this referral, everything was all about anger management. And you can see that there's definitely a lot of anger in his extremities, but really what's on the inside is he describes fear and sadness that's covered in love. And when we talked about this activity, he was really very much so kind of talking about his feelings with his mom and in his relationship with his mom. And if you try and imagine feeling fear, love, and sadness all at the same time for someone, try and imagine that literally, because it's a very confusing and ambivalent feeling. So next, in thinking about the external dynamic, right? So that's kind of the emotional climate in the home environment, right? So I'm not talking about like the kid isn't doing chores. I'm really talking about like how are the relationships? How is the parent-child relationship? And so a lot of times, a good way to start thinking about this is by making parents do feeling bodies too. And so this is Monique's feelings body. And as you can see, she filled her heart with anger and put unsure feelings in her stomach. She put a lot of sadness and anger and some happiness in her head and outlined her whole body in fear. And this feelings body was really kind of consistent with how she presented to us. It seemed like her moods were all over the place. And there were some days when she was really good and other days where she seemed incredibly anxious and would pick at her skin and bite her nails. And other days when she just seemed very irritable and agitated. And other days when she just seemed like she could barely get out of bed. So really, really, really trying to mentalize what a child's experience of their home environment is. I also threw in here mom's boyfriend, Gary, who, if you were kind of noticed on the genogram, had a long-standing substance use problems, heroin addiction from the age of 13. And he was well into his late 50s when we worked with him. So, and he really you know, he put love in his crotch area, which is very concrete, but he also filled his chest with sadness and put kind of in his extremities fear as well, in the same way that mom did. And a lot of happiness in his head. My thought is really that kind of the heroin was what was taking care of that. Both parents had a significant amount of childhood trauma themselves, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So what Elijah ends up choosing to describe what it's like to live with these two parents is walking on eggshells. Okay. So the buildup, really, again, I'm asking you to kind of think beyond diagnosis and think about what's happened in a child's life, what's happened to them. And so the effects of prolonged stress and trauma, we know, leads to kind of problems with relationships and boundaries, empathy, social isolation, all of these things that kind of fall under an attachment umbrella. Also physical health. So we have like sensory motor development and coordination problems, and you're more likely to have medical problems and somatic symptoms. Emotion regulation is a huge one. When you live with prolonged stress and trauma, you are less able to regulate your feelings. And especially when you have experienced trauma, you are going to have exaggerated responses following that trauma, which you cannot regulate. Dissociation, so altered states of consciousness, disconnection, withdrawal, impaired memory, cognitive ability, so we see problems with focus and learning and processing new information and language development and planning and executive functioning. We see kids who have kind of self-concept problems, lack of a consistent sense of self, body image issues, low self-esteem, shame, guilt, eating issues. And then just behavioral control, so impulsivity, aggression, defensiveness. All things that when you look at through a different lens might be diagnosed as oppositional defiant disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation, depression, anxiety. So we have this kind of theory of what's happening in his relationship with his mom, where he's externalizing, so he's becoming kind of out of control and aggressive and running away. And she comes at him and she blames him, which makes him hate himself even more. So he externalizes even more. So build-up behaviors really are behaviors that a child uses to cope with the buildup in emotions that they can't talk to anyone about. This buildup of kind of negative feelings. So something traumatic happens, you internalize that, then your home environment is not so great. Everyone feels very separate or disconnected, or maybe it's very conflictual. And so this starts to build up and is expressed behaviorally. And the parent reacts, often to just the behavior without taking into account the feelings and the context of the behavior. So really important here to remember that behaviors always communicate feelings. I know I've said that before, but it's you will catch yourself not remembering that. And it's really a parent's capacity to respond in a curious, playful, open, and sensitive way that will make a child feel loved and valued and known. When we look at non-mentalizing, so failures in mentalizing most frequently happen during periods of acute stress. And if you think about what's more stressful than a kid who's having behavioral problems, regardless of whether or not they're externalizing or internalizing, tends to be a really stressful experience for parents. On top, add on if they've had their own trauma history, right? So you get one end where you have this kind of projective, distorted mentalizing. So like, he's trying to hurt me, he's manipulative, they're doing it on purpose, he's unsafe, he's gonna kill me. All of these ideas that your child is genuinely trying to hurt you. Or at the other end, the parent who's just not thinking deeply about why their child is acting the way that they do, maybe not thinking at all about it. So we have this kind of overreaction and this underreaction. And what you are aiming for is to move everyone back to kind of curious. So some examples of Monique's problems with mentalizing. She could go into excessive detail in sessions about what he's doing, all of his behaviors, essentially trying to fill a whole hour with non-mentalizing. And so it was a lot of work to help her and to get her to a point where she was starting to think about motivations and feelings and thoughts. Did a lot of like name calling and essentializing, was really preoccupied with what should and shouldn't be without taking into context the history of their relationship. Denial of involvement into the problem. I have nothing to do with why he gets so dysregulated. That's him. He's the problem. He needs to learn coping skills. He needs medication. A lot of certainty about his thoughts and purposes. He's trying to taunt me. He likes to see me mad. And then the use of physical threatening as well, right? So being scary with her body, but not necessarily hitting. Other common ones you'll see, this kind of blaming and accusing. Sometimes you'll get parents that are very focused on diagnosis and want to explain everything to the kind of feel that the diagnosis eclipses someone's own subjective experience of how they're feeling. Name calling, threatening, shaming. People can do this directly or indirectly, often through comparisons. Sarcasm. Like I worked with a grandma who, when her grandson was kind of trying to communicate something, she would respond by saying, "You think?" And that was like really triggering for him, you know, even though I could see how that could be funny too, complicated. Prophesizing. So a lot of times parents are, you're going to end up in jail, you're going to end up in the psychiatric hospital, right? That never calms someone down, right? That never de-escalates. All of these things are kind of under the guise of trying to control behavior, but in fact, escalating feelings of worthlessness, shame, anger, rage, hate. Denying feelings, another huge trigger. And then, so we talk about mentalizing as what you say, but also what you do. So non-mentalizing in behavior, physical threatening, yelling, ignoring, and just kind of dissociating. So we have both. So there's this kind of like intrusive, aggressive parent, and then we also have this withdrawn, not present parent. And both are really, really difficult to experience as a child. Okay. So we have crisis. A picture self-portrait of Elijah where he looks scary. So what Elijah would do is he would run, and he would run away. He would throw things. He would sometimes push and scream and fight. And he was trying to run away and was chased by police and became very, very afraid. And then, you know, was trying to get away from the police. And so was psychiatrically hospitalized and went into residential for a period of time before he came to us. So putting all this information together, right? First step is really to do it for yourself in supervision, taking all the pieces of a case and kind of putting it in this order and thinking it through. Next step is doing it with the kid. So here is Elijah's. So for his unacknowledged loss, this is the circle that says past, to kind of represent the past. He chose ups and downs. And so this was in a family session that we were doing this. And so part of this is really getting and facilitating the acknowledgement of what's happened. And this can either be with you, just as a therapist, if you feel like the parent, there's not a clear parent choice, right? So there are some kids who just don't have clear primary parents because they're in the system, because none of their parents are functioning. So you can either be the one who's just acknowledging it, or you can be facilitating the parent and acknowledging it. Oftentimes, my recommendation is doing it with a child first and then pulling in a parent. And part of that conversation is asking the child, hey, do you feel safe sharing this with your parent? So for his unacknowledged loss, he chose lots of ups and downs. And we really took this as kind of a therapeutic opportunity to facilitate conversations between him and his mom that they had not had. So we talked about the homelessness. We talked about dad's incarceration together. We talked about mom's psychiatric problems together and her time away from him in the hospital. When we talked to him about kind of inside, what it felt like or what kind of messages were happening for him on repeat, he chose everything is crazy as being his kind of what he comes back to that makes him feel out of control and then act out of control. This feeling that there's no stability, there's no kind of safe person, that everything is like ups and downs and shifting sand. Then we talked about his experience of the home environment, which he chose the phrase, you don't know what you're going to get. And he really described quite eloquently coming home from school and some days mom meeting him with a smile on her face and like getting him snack and sitting down at the table with him and talking about his day and doing homework. And then other days when she's just not home and he doesn't know where she is. And other days when she can't get out of bed. And other days when he comes home and she's hanging out with her friends and drunk at 3 p.m. Just feeling like things that mom is really kind of a wild card for him, mom in particular. So then for his buildup, he chose, well, it's one of my 2 attitudes. And a lot of it depends on what I see from mom or what mom is kind of, how mom is feeling. So really kind of illustrating how intimately connected how a parent is doing is with how a child is doing. So he would describe on good days feeling good and calm and having no conflict. And on days when mom was kind of had friends over or he was really triggered by her drinking or smoking, because to him that was very connected with volatility, like emotional volatility. And so we were able to talk about this. And we talked a lot about mom perceiving that as being very deep disrespect. And so this idea that when he's disrespecting her, then mom's reaction is to disrespect him back. And you could see he put like a smiley face there because he was so nervous about talking to her about this and nervous about what her reaction was going to be. But we did a lot of prep work with mom too, and she heard and validated it.
Now it feels like the whole city is just vibrating with this energy that feels like progress. I can't think of anything that I would love more than what we're doing.
What was that? We should probably mute. There we go. Okay. So when mom disrespects him, he said he would go crazy. He would really lose it. And this would be kind of the ultimate confirmation that everything is crazy. And afterwards, after sharing this with mom, there was a difference in their relationship and there was an opening therapeutically. So now kind of the last half an hour, today I'm going to talk more about parent and adult work. Because my perspective is really that whenever you're doing child work, if I imagine plenty of you are thinking about going into it, you should also be doing parent work, and you should not avoid parents because they're hard. They need help often. And so I think a really key part of working with children and adolescents, whether you're in an outpatient or a home-based setting, is really, really reaching out and working with the parent as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about adverse childhood experiences. These are kind of, I talked about it underneath the umbrella before. Very specifically, there's a tool called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Inventory that asks about 10 questions that are very specific about physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and kind of what is broadly thought of as kind of household dysfunction. So mental illness, domestic violence, parental divorce, substance use, etc., incarceration. And so what these studies really found was that adverse childhood experiences are surprisingly common. A lot of folks are endorsing them. They still have a profound effect 50 years later. So your childhood really matters. These are really transformed from attachment experiences into physical disease, social dysfunction, and mental illness, and are the main determinant of health and social well-being in the US. We also know that in the US, this is highly associated with poverty, class, and race. With kids in the US, with kind of Black, Hispanic, Latinx, and Indigenous American children being the most likely to experience adverse childhood experiences. So know that they have a cumulative effect. So the more that you endorse, the more likely you are to experience negative outcomes. We also know that this is intimately linked with a parent's ability to mentalize, bringing it full circle. So when a parent has early trauma, they're more likely to have problems later in life, particularly during their parenting years. So things like substance use problems, mental health problems, unemployment, medical problems, and so on. We also know that having had adverse experiences, this is intimately linked to your ability to mentalize. Going back to kind of my earlier stories about why a child shuts down their mentalizing capacity. And this is, I'm not talking about it like it's a voluntary and conscious act, right? But why it's a way of adapting to a situation that is unsafe. You stop thinking about it. You stop trying to think about the motives and intentions of the unsafe. We also know that when a parent's ability to mentalize is essential to a child's mental health and to their ability to kind of tolerate and process painful or distressing feelings. Low mentalizing capacity has been associated with infant disorganized attachment and ultimately child and adolescent mental health problems. So these things are all connected. So we have adverse childhood experiences that really disrupts neurodevelopment, leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, the adoption of health risk behaviors, which really is kind of your way of adapting or your way of coping with your circumstance, leads to later disease, disability, and social problems, and ultimately early death. And so if we have this triangle, that is the parent, I would say this top tier is what's really going to impact your parenting. And we capture it on the family cycle when we try and describe the external dynamic or the home environment, and the external reaction or the parent's response, non-mentalizing response to the child. And then this sets the stage for a child's own adverse childhood experiences. So you can really see the transmission. So why do it with parents? You'll deepen the relationship with them. It's really important for them to trust you if you're working closely with their kid. Build trust. It'll help them feel seen and understood by you. We also, helping a parent acknowledge their own important childhood experiences is trauma work. It's introductory trauma work with a parent. It's creating a cohesive self-narrative, self-awareness, understanding why they act the way that they act. It's also part of modeling why and how to talk about difficult life experiences. And this sets the stage for a parent to be able to potentially safely explore their child's. And ultimately, this belief that I have that supporting the parent and acknowledging how their own childhood experiences influence their parenting is the first step towards them beginning to think about changing their parenting approach. So we go from very highly stressed and defensive and try and move someone down through the experience of epistemic trust and being accurately mentalized. And that's the job of the therapist, of you. And this is really a parallel process to your work with the child as well. So when we look at Monique's adverse childhood experiences, she said, yes, she had a parent or adult in her household that swore, insulted, and humiliated her, and that made her feel afraid. She said, yes, that she had a parent who pushed, grabbed, slapped, and threw things at her and hit her so hard that there were marks. She said, yes, an adult or person 5 years or older touched or fondled and touched her body in a sexual way when she was a child. She said, yes, her dad was frequently too drunk to take care of her. She said that, yes, she watched her stepmother be pushed, grabbed, slapped, and have things thrown at her and threatened with a gun. She said, yes, there was a lot of drugs and alcohol around her growing up. And she said, yes, that her stepmother became very depressed in her kind of the later stages of her life and rarely left her room. So a lot of times when people are using this inventory, it's kind of like, okay, we learn all of this information and leave it there. And really kind of what I'm proposing is that you then take this a step further. So you learn about these things to help you kind of conceptualize where the parent is coming from. but then you also help them make sense of the full picture. So when I kind of asked Monique for a summary of like, kind of how would she summarize all of these different adverse childhood experiences? She chose, no one protected me. And that really being kind of this, her repeated and most formative experience of her childhood. There was no one who she felt was going to protect her. And so she internalized this as, I should never have been born. I shouldn't even be here in the first place. And at home, she chose walking on eggshells to describe her dad and what he was like when he would come home drunk. And she described holding her shame in and trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible so as not to become his target. And then ultimately said that this was not, it didn't even work. He would seek her out and put her down anyways. And these experiences would just reinforce, I should have never been born. I shouldn't be here. I should never have been born. Until ultimately she got out. But this getting out led to a lot of instability, which you see reflected in Elijah's family cycle. So when we kind of put these two cycles together and think about their relationship, we see this kind of relationship between you don't know what you're going to get and walking on eggshells. This very kind of similar home environments where Monique has unintentionally and unconsciously replicated her own experience of as a child for her son. We also have this parallel between mom disrespects me and dad put me down. So again, mom unintentionally and outside of her own awareness, replicating her own childhood experience and almost becoming her father in this scenario with her dad. Helping her sort through her own childhood really set the stage for her to be able to imagine and tolerate his own, her son's. She's also able to make a lot of different links and eventually kind of begin to see that there was a way in which she was kind of recreating this intergenerational pattern of aggression and alcohol, but also a way in which her son's behavior was really triggering these out of control feelings that she had from her childhood. And this feeling, I should have never been born. So kind of in those moments when he is misbehaving, she would go back to this, I should have never been born. I shouldn't even be a mom. I shouldn't even, I should have never done this. And those thoughts really amped up her response to him. So instead of being able to kind of shift and think about what's going on for my son, he's being so disrespectful and oppositional. I wonder how he's feeling. I wonder what his day was like. I wonder if there's something I'm doing that's upsetting him. So that would be a mentalizing. No, she moved immediately to threat and control, which would escalate instead of de-escalate. Okay. So any questions before? It's a lot of pretty dense material. I have a couple other examples to go through. Okay. So the other piece about this activity, right, is that I use it across the state of Connecticut in the program that I'm the director of, but also am really into kind of open source and wanting folks to use it in a lot of different venues and formats as they see fit. It's also something you can kind of make your own, right? So there's no like, you have to do it this way. So I've brought a bunch of different ones that other clinicians have done, whom I supervise or who have learned it. People send them to me sometimes. And so this clinician here decided to kind of think about the family cycle as a series of different sessions. And after each session would kind of summarize the theme with the child on a note card and then put it all together. I thought that was really creative. You can pull in drawing and make it kind of artistic and creative. And so for this kid, her unacknowledged loss was leaving. The family had relocated like 5 times, I think, over the course of her childhood. And she talked about that making her feel really rootless and like they were very disconnected from any kind of extended family, that just this feeling that they had no one. And so this was internalized as no one cares. She felt like mom was very fake. And so she put fake it till you make it in the external dynamic. She kind of described her mom as always trying to pretend like everything was okay. And so she would kind of test the limits of that because it agitated her. She was kind of feel frustrated and annoyed, and until she got to the point where mom would have a huge overreaction and then things would explode. Oops. Another one, very type A clinician who wanted to use Post-it notes and, used Post-it notes to kind of jot down, did kind of a more interview style family cycle and used Post-it notes to jot down notes and kind of put it together with the kid. This kid said, of never feeling loved or connected. The belief things will never get better. I hate myself. At home, mean comments, invalidation. So the buildup is I would isolate, shut down, feel anxious and depressed. And then this could describe the parents' reaction as they get mad when I don't communicate. So when she is feeling shut down, anxious and depressed, the parents' reaction is to get angry with her and say, why don't you just talk about your feelings? Right? Which then kind of would bring her back to this is never going to get better, leading to kind of more suicidality and self-harm. This kid, clearly he did that me at the end, so clearly this kind of resonated with him. Really talked a lot about losing dad as being a huge unacknowledged loss, and mom not being able to talk to him about that because dad was a big source of trauma for mom. Again, you have this theme of like, I shouldn't have been born, I shouldn't be here. You will notice the more you do these, you will start to notice patterns. Home environment, he's really kind of pushing everyone away, but also at the same time couldn't be alone. And would kind of behave in a way in which his family would eventually yell and insult him and tell him that they didn't want him to be there, which again would escalate him. Charlotte, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just, thank you for this. This has been very good. In my career in social work before I came to teach, I spent some of the 20 years in child welfare as a child welfare worker. And by no means is child welfare work therapy, but my question is, because some of these principles, because if you're going to help a family in child welfare, you have to get to the underlying trauma at some level. You have to, and you have to help as best you can with whatever tools you have to help them understand how their trauma exacerbates the situation, the adults at any rate. So it feels, I am not a therapist, but it feels familiar because as a child welfare worker, if you've done it for a while, you begin to develop habits that work for you in getting the information from the families and in either during investigation or in trying to help them reunify. Either way, it just it resonates with me, and I don't know if have you ever done any work with any child welfare agencies, not to do therapy, but the
like
principles of this? Yeah.
Not in Connecticut. I've done actually some with Haruv.
Okay.
But
yeah, we actually had a series with the DHS here.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an approach that probably more folks in child welfare could, it's very clinical is the thing. And I think a lot of times folks in child welfare are just wanting to go in and fix the problem, but probably more often than not find that it's a really layered and complex and deep problem, which is kind of, that's my primary population is kids in child welfare and kids who, maybe not kids who are in it long term, but kids who kind of go in and out of it. And so it's a different kind of family therapy when you're working with kind of multi-generational trauma. Is kind of, the approach of this. And instead of maybe pretending that that's not the case, really going in there and saying, okay, let's do some kind of cursory trauma work with both the parent and the child. And let's see if we can use that to make a bridge to kind of create a new relational reality or way of relating to each other.
Yeah, not by any means that child welfare workers could do therapy, but being aware that this is something they need to be looking for and or to be aware of.
Well, because a lot of times child welfare workers are non-mentalizing, right? They'll go in and they'll focus on behavior and say, okay, just get out of bed and, do the dishes, and aren't aware that, mom is constantly verbally berating this child, so they don't want to help them.
Right.
Yeah, there are a lot of things.
I think something you said early on resonated with me, because when I would go into a home and on investigation, after a while, I got to the point where I would ask, how did we get here?
Yeah. There's always a story. There's always a history.
Yeah, which seemed to open up a conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. So here is the one that I was talking about earlier, the child who chose sad fragments. And it's really almost, it makes it even more painful because he used disappearing ink too. So he chose sad fragments, and then he said this made him blame himself. And at home, I said his home environment was very unstable. He was kind of moving between different homes. So he was biological mom, and then in a different foster home, and then in a different one, and then in a respite home. And so he started to act out in school. School was kind of the only safe place. Wasn't able to focus. Clearly, he didn't even have a home. He wasn't sure if his mom was okay. Couldn't focus, acting out, walking out of the classroom. And then at home, or when he would talk to his birth mom about that, he called this kind of mommy is easy on me, which we really felt was capturing a really profound underreaction. So her kind of not being able to muster much of a reaction at all due to, in this case, this was kind of profound depression. And ultimately his crisis that kind of brought him to us was the suicidal ideation, going back to he blames himself for having no one. This is one a clinician did with a teenager and a parent. And what is kind of most remarkable about this is how similar the parent's experience as a child was to the child's, but that their kind of adaptation or their way of coping or their buildup, all very much interrelated concepts. One is an externalizer, mom, and one is an internalizer, child. Otherwise, almost exactly the same reactions or responses to the rest of the cycle. And then we'll end on this. So the other thing, I guess, kind of in response to you, Charlotte, is that I work with a lot of early career clinicians. And so part of laying this out was kind of trying to create a roadmap for early career folks who are in extremely complex situations where there's a lot of different moving parts. And so this was actually an intern did this. And I helped her kind of create the purple in a way that to prompt her. And then she filled in the pink and afterwards felt that it had been kind of one of the most in-depth conversations that she had had thus far. So she was able to kind of ask the right questions and open up a conversation with this kid about the parent in a way that felt different than the way other therapists had. So that's what I have.
I think we can open up for a couple of questions. I see there's one in the chat.
Okay.
We can maybe start with that, and you're welcome to, or if you have.
Hold on. Ooh.
We have one from Christina. What does the timeline look like for these cases? Like with Monique and Elijah case, how long did it take to get from first encounter to when both cycles were aligned in session?
Mm-hmm.
Victoria, I think we lost you for a second.
You did, but I'm back now, hopefully.
Okay, good.
So my program is 6 months. And so it's quite intensive though. When so I'll answer for my program first, and then I'll answer for different kind of outpatient settings. My program, it's very intensive. We're in the home a couple times a week. So I believe that most states have versions of in-home programs. I think the difference is most states only have one clinician and we have two. So the parent gets a separate person where I'm at, which is really useful, but most states are not going to pay for. So it's a 6-month program aiming to do the child cycle with the child by month 2, ideally. So kind of the idea being that there's a lot of groundwork and a lot of history, and you're moving up to really helping them kind of create a narrative about how their life has, instead of this kind of, you're a diagnosis, or you're just born this way, or you're bad, or, you know, how they've adapted to their life, and then kind of beginning to think about how to shift some of that and how to feel differently. So that happens at about 2 months. Usually the parents takes longer, closer to 4 months. And then the family one is something when we can do, and it's not always the case, in that last month. So in month kind of 5 or 6, doing with the family and kind of supporting. And then ideally it's like bridging that, using that to bridge into outpatient therapy. And we always love it when we can get both the child and the parent into outpatient therapy. Yeah. In an outpatient setting, I think the timeline's a little bit longer just because there tends to be more inconsistency with outpatient, and it's harder to get parents. So to me, what I hear more is people trying it out on folks that they have already been working with. So I've heard of this in an outpatient setting. If it's brand new, I think it would be more of kind of whether when you are trying to do your hypothesis, if you have all of the pieces, then thinking through whether it's time to move forward and share it with the family. Yeah.